Hello! So, uh, I've just read the third part of probably four. I think I'm going to divide the book into four. But I've just read the third part of Forest Mage by Robin Hobb. And this is an interesting section with a lot to talk about. So, in this section, Nivare finally reaches Geddes, which is something that has been foreshadowed since, I think, the first book, sort of Nivare's journey heading east, and Geddes is as far east as Gernia goes. So, once he goes east of Geddes, which I suspect will happen soon, he will fully become part of the spec culture. But for now, he is in Geddes, and he has been employed as I was going to say a grave digger, but he's more than that. He's the guy who tends the graveyard. Like the whole graveyard is his charge in a way. So he digs graves, he guards them, he does upkeep on the graveyard. I guess that's still a gravedigger. He also has a series during his time here in Geddes at the graveyard. He has a series of encounters with specs, which are, I believe, some of his first encounters with specs in person, other than the caged ones at the end of the previous book. He also encounters a bunch of people from his old life who are all inexplicably in Geddes right now. And he also has some interesting encounters with various women. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But I'm going to start with sort of some general praise for the writing, which I've done a lot of, but I feel the need to do some more. Robin Hobb has an incredible talent for really, really quickly painting very vivid characters. Characters like Buell Hitch, Amzil, the I don't remember his title, but the guy in charge of Geddes, the two specs that Nivare meets in this section. All of these characters have just a handful of scenes, and in those handful of scenes, they are incredibly well characterized and developed characters. You get the sense that you know them fully as people, in a way that I've seen authors who have much larger page counts to work with a given character not succeed to this extent to make them a vivid and memorable character. Also, this section is probably the section so far that I've read that makes Nivare himself the most interesting character. He's obviously going through a lot, but his internal life, his internal monologue, his drives, his motivations, his thoughts are more interesting here than they've ever been, because clearly things are heading towards some kind of forced resolution. He will be forced to make his actual final choice in terms of like his Gernian versus his spec side by the end of this book. And clearly we are accelerating towards that, because he is now actually openly considering that. In the last few chapters of this section, he is finally explicitly voicing to himself the idea that he might have this choice, that he might actually have the option of abandoning Gernian society and joining the specs, and that it might be an appealing option for him. Which is very interesting. there are a couple of things that are sort of overarching themes here that I want to talk about and maybe dissect some of the potential problems I see with them. Um, one of them is the use of sex in the story. So it is very refreshing to see a fantasy novel that has a mature attitude towards sex and uses it as an actual important part of a character's personality, of a character's motivations, of a character's life, um, and also manages to uh, get very potent character moments out of Nevare's various sexual escapades during this section of the book. So I am very pleased with that. I am pleased with the frank and, like I said, very mature way that sex is handled in this book, which is more than I can say for a lot of fantasy novels. However, there are some things I find troubling. Not necessarily troubling, maybe, but just sort of personally very unappealing to me, I guess. First of all, the whole thing where Nevare goes to the brothel and uses his magic to give a sex worker seemingly her first ever orgasm is, I think, the implication. And then she changes her entire life because now she realizes how good sex can be, and so she stops being a sex worker. It's to me at least feels like some fan fiction Marty Stew type thing going on there with Nevare. Like, really? Your main character is just happens to be a sex god? I mean, it's magic in this case. It's not actually any skill on Nevare's part, and the book makes that clear. It made that clear that this isn't like Nevare being very skilled. So this isn't like a situation like what's it called? What's Wise Man's Fear, the second Kingkiller Chronicles book. If you know, you know. If you've read that book, you know why I'm bringing it up. It has a lengthy sequence of the main character inexplicably being a sex god. But here that's not the case. Here it is justified narratively. It doesn't like break my immersion or anything, but it felt a bit cheesy, I guess. And the other thing that I'm sort of slightly troubled by with the way sex is handled in this section of the story is the repeated, like, multiple cases sort of stacking up of Nevare being wrongfully seen as sexually predatory, wrongfully seen as potentially a rapist, or at least someone who could be one. Women being afraid of him, people accusing him of harassing women on sight, accusing him of killing the sex worker who quit her job because of him. All of that stuff happening just because he's not conventionally attractive. I'm gonna say it. It kind of reads like some weird incel propaganda. I'm not saying that's what Robin Hobb is doing by any stretch of the imagination, but that's what it resembles. Like, it feels like it sort of buys into the whole, oh, women will let a man get away with anything as long as he's handsome, but if he's fat and ugly, then suddenly they'll accuse him of assault. And, like, that's a really weird narrative that has nothing to do with reality. So I'm obviously someone who is not conventionally attractive will be treated very differently in romantic and sexual contexts by the society around them. But I feel like the specific way it's being portrayed here kind of feeds into some not quite accurate narratives. So that's something I'm a bit uncomfortable with, frankly, in this section. But also it does sort of serve the larger sort of plot purpose of driving a wedge between Navarre and Guernian society even more and pushing him towards the specs. So I do get why it's there. I just wish it had maybe been handled a bit differently. Anyway, what else goes on here? Right, the other major thing that I am somewhat troubled by in this section is we are finally seeing more of the specs. So far, the specs have largely just been represented by Tree Woman, who lives in Navarre's dreams. So, like, we haven't really seen their culture, first or second hand, really. And what little we've heard about them, we've heard from Guernians. So it made sense that what we heard was sort of filled with stereotypes and very simplified, very stereotypical, sort of noble, savage bullshit. But now we're actually seeing their culture directly, and I'm still getting some weird, noble, savage vibes from the way they are portrayed. The whole, they're closer to nature, so they don't wear clothes, and they're sexually liberated. They have sex out in the open. All they care about are the needs of the flesh. They care about food and sex and drink, and they care about the trees, and they protect the trees, and it feels like some weird stereotyping of like sort of how people imagine Native Americans were. And I'm not yet comfortable saying that that's what it is. Because so far, Robin Hobb has done a really good job of not stumbling headfirst into traps like that. So I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt, and I'm willing to sort of wait it out and see where this particular portrayal goes. But if the portrayal of spec culture stays at what it is right now, I won't be super happy about that. It'll feel a bit stereotypical and maybe a bit racist. It just, I don't know. Something about it rubs me the wrong way. Likewise, of course, I've already talked before how there's the threat of some white saviorism going on with this particular storyline. That does appear to be where we're going right now. I still think that by the end of the third book, that won't be sort of the actual conclusion of the story. I think Navarre's role is a lot more complicated than the words white savior would imply. But for right now, it kind of feels like he might be leaning in that direction, which is potentially unfortunate. But there are some things I really like about the specs as well. I really like the interactions between Navarre, Olikea, and her father. I really like how we as the reader, or at least I as the reader, can read a lot more into those interactions than Navarre can. Like, you can kind of see the shape of what Olikea and her father are thinking, and why they speak to him in certain ways, why they say certain things, do certain things, etc. Especially her father, whose name escapes me right now, but Olikea's father has this really great scene where he's alone with Navarre, without Olikea, and he's basically teaching him a bunch of really basic shit that in his mind Navarre should know as a quote unquote great one of the specs. But of course it would be disrespectful to tell a great one that they don't know something. And so he has to frame it in a way where he's not implying that Navarre doesn't know, but he is still actively teaching him. And Navarre eventually catches on to that. Like, Navarre figures it out eventually and calls him out on it. But it's a really fun chapter. I liked it. What else? Right. Magic. So, we don't see a ton of cases of Navarre actually using his magic here, other than the magic orgasm that he gave that one girl. But we do see a fair amount of magic at work. In particular, whenever Navarre goes into the forest. So the forest, as we are now learning, seems to sort of have a mind of its own. And that mind of its own manifests as a sort of emotional miasma that affects people who enter the forest. And sorry. Depending on the time and depending on the place you enter the forest, this can take the form of sort of weariness and extreme exhaustion, or it can take the form of like terror and sort of blood-curdling fear. And the latter is what is happening at the end of the road. That's why the road can't go on, the Great King's Great Road. And we also learned that the reason that is happening is because the road is about to go through a huge grove of special trees that are, I think it's implied that the trees are all essentially former great ones, like the tree woman. She's one of those trees now, and Navarre actually meets her in person here in tree form. But if the road keeps going forward, it will cut through a grove of those trees and cause irreparable damage. And that's why the forest and the specs are all sort of like fighting to stop the road at all costs. So it's interesting because I did not expect the actual physical building of the road itself to be the crux of the conflict. I thought that the road was just sort of a symptom of general Guernian colonization of the forest, and that's why the specs were antagonistic towards Guernia. But no, it is the literal physical building of the road that is the problem, which is interesting. It's not what I expected, and it's more unique than I expected. It's certainly more unique than just having it be sort of your standard colonization and conquest narrative. Which, I mean, obviously that is still a thing that is going on. Like, if the road goes on, Guernia will expand and conquer and colonize all of these people. That is true. But it is interesting that the road is more than just a symptom of that. It is itself an act of violence that the Guernians just don't understand. They aren't aware of it. So that's interesting. Also interesting is the idea that the reason that they've been stealing bodies from the cemetery is because they want to plant those bodies like trees and have them grow into trees in the hopes that Guernians will be less willing to cut down trees that are made out of their own people, which is interesting because it shows that the specs have a fairly deep and fundamental lack of understanding of Guernian culture, in much the same way that the Guernians have a fundamental lack of understanding of spec culture. Because of course the Guernians won't care, that won't stop them, but it would stop the specs, so they figure it would also stop the Guernians. I am reminded both by the general theme of people being of like this total misunderstanding between cultures, and by the specific nature of the whole tree planting thing. I am reminded of Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card. It feels like an almost direct inspiration for some of what's going on here. Um, and as much as I loathe Orson Scott Card for a variety of reasons, Speaker for the Dead is undoubtedly his best book, and certainly the one I remember most fondly from when I read him. So that's a very nice thing to be reminded of, and I recommend reading that book, by the way. I recommend reading Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead, and then no other book by Orson Scott Card. Everything else is bad. But you can read those two. They're very good. And totally incongruous with Orson Scott Card's incredibly disturbing personal values. Anyway, that's off topic. Yeah, so the tree planting thing is interesting, and I'm curious to see where it goes. There's also another element of magic, I think, going on here. And I say I think because no characters have yet acknowledged that this might be a supernatural thing. And I'm not sure that it is, but I have a suspicion. And the thing I'm talking about is the extremely unlikely confluence of characters converging on Geddes right now. Spink, Epinny, Carcina, Amzil, all of these people from Nevare's life are all suddenly showing up in Geddes right when he gets there. Now, of course, we knew Spink and Carcina were going there. Not Spink and Carcina, Spink and Epinny were going there. And Amzil came there because of Nevare. Carcina is kind of a wild card. It's not really clear whether her coming here was something that could at all have been predicted. But all of these things are plausible. It's not impossible that these are all coincidences, but I feel like there might be too many of them at this point, and it feels like maybe something is going on there. Either Geddes itself or Nevare himself might be drawing these people to this location, is what I'm thinking. In the same way that the magic guides Nevare by sort of making seemingly random events occur that push him in the direction that the magic wants, I can't help but wonder if that's also how Carcina got here, or how Amzil got here, or how Spink and Epinny got here. Especially Spink and Epinny, because Epinny is very much in tune with magical forces. So I'm looking forward to seeing if that gets acknowledged as an explicitly supernatural element of the plot going forward. It might not be, like I said, it could just also be a coincidence. Who knows? But speaking of Epinny, Nevare still hasn't told her he's here. Only Spink knows he's here. Well, and Carcina, but that's... I'm not getting into that. I've already talked about how weird I find the way women treat Nevare now. Anyway, Epinny, I am curious when we're going to get any sort of resolution for that, because I'm sure he's going to tell Epinny he's here sometime. Epinny is one of those characters who, when she was introduced in book 1, immediately felt like she was going to be one of the main characters of the story and incredibly important to Nevare's journey going forward. And then so far, she just hasn't been. But obviously, I'm only about halfway through the trilogy. There's still plenty of time for her to become that. So I'm not discounting it yet. I still think Epinny is going to be a much more important character at some point. I think that might be everything I wanted to talk about in this section. Let me just briefly look at my notes to make sure. But I do think that is probably... okay, on the topic of sex, it was extremely funny when the sex worker um, decided to go down on Navarre, and his internal monologue was something like, "Oh my God, I had heard of such depraved acts, but I had never thought to witness one firsthand." The unspeakable depravity of blowjobs. It makes sense culturally, like that. That is how. I mean, oral sex was viewed as a type of sodomy for most of history, at least in sort of Christian culture. So that makes sense. But also, it's just very funny from like the perspective of today when it's seen as like one of the more vanilla things you can do. Um. Anyway, does anything else interesting happen here? Yeah, there. I do want to briefly just touch on the scene where Navarre meets Tree Woman in the forest in her tree form, and they have a conversation. I am not entirely clear, and I don't think this is like bad writing. I think I'm not supposed to be clear. Whether that really happened, whether it was a hallucination, a vision, whether Navarre was physically there, whether that specific tree really was Tree Woman. Um, it's a very strange scene because so much of it is left sort of up in the air, whether it's really physically happening. And I like that. I really like the surreal feel of that scene in retrospect. Like, did that even happen? I don't know. I don't know if that really happened. Um, but I'm going to, for now, go with the assumption that it did happen as it was written, like that was in fact a literal physical encounter. But we'll see. We'll see whether that stays the case. Um, anyway, that's all I have to say about this section of the book. I am probably not going to record again until I finish the second book. So see you whenever I get around to doing that, because I'm falling behind on my reading lately. I'm very busy in school. So see you hopefully next week. Bye.